Hello and welcome to the Threads of Wisdom podcast. I want to give you a short intro so you know why we're here. As a catalyst and executive coach for Christian women in leadership, I've been studying Christian women in leadership for the past 21 years. And there are three gaps I see that I believe this podcast will fill. Number one, Christian women leaders and women who work are not mentored. Number two, they are not affirmed in their calling or their work or the position that they're in. And number three, the wisdom of Christian women in leadership is not being passed down to the next generations and current generations. And so that's what this podcast seeks to do. What you'll get from this podcast is a little different than other podcasts. You will hear the real stories of Christian women in leadership, mostly in the marketplace. Number two, you'll get real wisdom and advice on how to integrate faith at work and how they do it and what they do. And I hope that that's beneficial to you. The last thing is, at the end of each episode, we're going to challenge you to take one or two pieces of what you heard, wisdom, and actively apply it in your leadership, in your management, in your work. So that's it. I hope you'll dive in with us. God bless the work of your hands. Hello, all, and welcome to another podcast edition of Threads of Wisdom. I'm here with Janey Walker from Trabuco Canyon, California. She's the CEO and founder of Classic Mail Solutions. Janey, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So glad to have you with us. You have a very interesting story to tell. So let's talk about yourself. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I lived there with my parents until I was 4. And then there was no work there anymore. My dad worked for the railroads. And so we came out west, so to speak. And he came out here and worked as a draftsman. So I grew up in Southern California my whole entire life. I got married at 19. My son was born when I was just a little over 20. And I did not go to work at all until he was 18 months old. And then through a series of events with my husband's business, I did have to go back to work. So I started, I don't want to call it a career. I started working in a company called Thrift and Loan Company. And that was quite an adventure. I spent 8 hours a day on the phone writing out credit reports, which are now so automated, they're done in 2 seconds, but it was all day on the phone, and it was a rather interesting position. But it was a good start for me, and it was a good experience. I learned really quickly, Carolyn, that I did not want to stay in I wasn't ready to go into management, but I knew right away that I did not want to stay in a position where everybody was always like, you're the bottom of the totem pole. I wanted to learn as much as I could within any company that I went to work for. So I learned really early on in my life that I had a real propensity for business. It wasn't until later that I really fell backwards into what I was doing in the mailing industry. But for the most part, I love to learn. I love to ask questions, just be a part of the business in any way that that I could. And that most of that came from my grandmother. She and I were very, very close. And when I was younger, she used to tell me all the time, Janey, when you're in a company, you learn everything you can. Everything you possibly can. Volunteer, do jobs that aren't yours. Don't ever say that's not my job, because when you leave that company, for whatever reason you leave, the only thing they can't take from you is the knowledge that you've gained. And I really took that to heart in everywhere that I worked, because I feel like every job that I went to, whether it was mundane or as I grew, I always grew quickly within the company, and I just love to learn. I love to learn everything I possibly could.
Yeah. Well, listen, you have a very interesting business. Can you explain the commingling business for us?
Absolutely, I can. What commingling means, the United States Postal Service under Anthony Frank, who was the postmaster at the time, had such large volumes of mail that they were not able to handle it on their own. They knew they weren't going to be able to get through it. So they developed programs over time to solicit the help of private industry to put mail in certain order, not just like 1 through 10, but in the order in which it was being moved through the postal system. So they wrote programs up that were called workshare programs that allowed you as a company to put your mail in certain order and then deliver it to the postal service in that order. So the deeper you move the mail within the system, so to speak, in the order that you placed it, the deeper the discounts you received. Well, private industry quickly learned that if you're a mailer that's producing 1,000 pieces of mail in your mail center, the workshare discounts were really written for volumes. So the pre-sort industry was formed to take advantage of that. So basically, what a pre-sort company or commingling company does is they go out to all of in a certain location and pick up mail from the various different mail rooms, bring it back into the central location, sort it according to the postal regulations, and then deposit it with the postal service and able to take those discounts. Early on, those discounts were shared 50-50 between the customer, the owner of the mail, and the pre-sort company. So it's a very lucrative business.
Yeah.
When I started in it, everything was sorted by hand. We had cardboard sort
Wow.
cages where 700 employees stood in front of them and hand sorted mail in various different sequence. I think it was about maybe 3 years into it. Bell and Howell developed sorting machines, and so they were able to bring those, they brought them into actually to the company that I was working first in a beta test where they actually tested the sorting machine and they started sorting everything through equipment at that point in time. But it's a
Hmm.
fascinating business and it's a very, very large industry, very large industry.
So you worked with a lot of the major players during your career, but there was a point in time in 2017 where the Lord led you to start your own business. Would you tell us about that journey briefly, and how old were you at the time?
Absolutely. I was 67, almost 68. Um, During the time that I was working in the commingling business, part of my job was to go out and meet with some of the big mail service providers that actually printed and got the mail ready for our company to commingle. And I thought it was really fascinating because I would go out and I would talk to them about the commingling process and what they could save. And in many situations, they didn't have an interest in that. The mail service provider that was providing it, printing the mail. They were, postage was a pass through. The customer was going to pay if they sorted their job separately, whether they paid X amount of money or whether they sorted them through us, they paid X amount of money. And I always thought that was really a fascinating situation because there's so much money from the Postal Service workshare discounts on the table to be shared. And I thought it was short-sighted of them to look at it, but that wasn't my job at the time. My job was to bring them into the company. Um, in the latter part of 17, the company that I was working with made some really dramatic changes. And as you and I have talked before, it was a good company. There were just a lot of people that were within that company that, in my opinion, were morally bankrupt. They'd had no ethics in business. And it just got to a point that I did not want to work there any longer. So I left. I had always been methodical about my career, my reputation in the business, and I never wanted to make a mistake with that. I protected it very with everything. And
Okay.
I made a decision. I was offered a job or recruited, I should say, from one of my top customers. And I left. And that was one time in my life that I made a decision to leave because I just wanted out of the company that I was working with. And I don't think no, I'm not going to say I don't think, I know that I did not ask for God's guidance the way I should have during
Mm,
this because it was a mistake.
mm,
But it it turned out to be the best. you know, he works all things for good.
Indeed, he
Um,
does.
I I got over to that company and I realized, in a period of time that it was a mistake and that they were not conducting themselves, in honesty with the Postal Service and how they were depositing mail. So I left. I went to, the Postal Service, and I told all of my contacts there that I'm leaving. I want you to know that I'm leaving. And then I went down and I filed for Social Security. And while I was there, the woman said, "Well, you're in a really good position, Janie, because you're going to get dinosaured into the last of this, but you're going to be in a position where you can make as much money as you want and still collect Social Security," which is not the case, I don't think, anymore. But,
No.
you know, when we got home, I made a couple of phone calls and I started doing things like just on the side, selling envelopes or, introducing people to each other. And I realized it was working really well for me. Then I got a call from an individual to sell some envelopes to them. I went over, got the envelopes done. I brought it in for testing, went through the whole gamut with them. And one day, there was a gentleman that was in the corner of this company. He always sat in the corner office, and he was just an amazing individual, but he came out thick Australian accent, and he said, "I'd like to take you to lunch because I have a business proposition for you." So we went to lunch, and just to back that up a little bit, during this time, I knew I wanted to start my own business. So I had met with an attorney, I had met with an accountant, I had gone through everything, and I had penciled out what it was going to cost me
Mhm.
to start my business. So we went to lunch, and he said, "I don't know a thing about mail. This company that I am working for the courts on as a receiver, they want to go out of business. They want to sell the company or dissolve it. I don't know which. But the judge basically told them, you have a great company. You need to go back. You need to put on your big boy panties," is what she told them, "and fix this company. You've got good people working for you." Well, during that time is when the judge appointed the court receiver, and that was Richard. We went out to lunch, and he said, "I want you to come in. What would you charge me?" So I knew exactly what I needed to get my business going, and that's where I went with it. And I probably should have charged him more, but it all worked out really, really well. I mean, he jumped on it. So it was good. I did that for 3 months. And during that time, after I had done an analysis of what was going on in the office and made recommendations to them on things that they should do, he handed me their password to their CRM. And he said, "I need you to go through this and I need you to call all the customers that we lost and find out why we lost them." And so, in the process of doing that, I reached out to one customer. His name was Steven, and he was with a lead gen company. And I asked him, "Why did you leave?" And he said, "Well, first of all, that those guys are so expensive, and they're it's just not my cup of tea." And I said, "Well, is there anything at all we can do for you?" And he said, "Yes, you can get me some data. If you can get me good data, that's what I need." Well, during the company that I worked with prior, they did a lot of data sales, and I met some individuals during that time. So I called one of them and I got him some data, and he purchased it for a couple of months, and it just turned his business around.
Hmm.
Um, and during that time, I was doing some consulting with him on his mail processing and explained to him that he could move the mail from a first class environment to a marketing environment, which is the old standard mail, and
Mhm.
still be able to save quite a bit of money and get it there maybe a day later. So he bought the data. Everything was running really, really smoothly. And Richard came up to me one day about a month into this, and he said, "Janie, um, the court all gave approval for these gentlemen to dissolve the business. So we've got 30 days to shut it down." And I said, "Well, what about these customers that I brought on board? What do you want me to do with them?" And so he went back to one of the owners, Dave, and he said, "She's got a big prospect here. What do you want her to do with it?" And his name was probably next to chauvinist in the dictionary. And he basically said, "If she thinks she can handle it, you let her have it." And so I said, "Well, you make sure you get that in writing from him because once this customer
Right.
takes off, he's going to want it back." So he did. We got it in writing. 30 days later, well, I called Stephen and I said, "This is what's happening." And he said, "After what you've done for me, I'll follow you anywhere. I'll be your first customer." And so that that started my business rolling. And um, it was really rewarding to me because during the entire time that I was in the business, I knew in my heart of hearts that nobody paid enough attention to the postage optimization for customers. They just didn't do it.
Interesting.
And so it worked for this customer and it's worked for every other customer that I brought in. Now, I'm not going to say that I can save everybody money, but in
Right.
some cases they just never look at that. And so I moved from commingle because my company's not bringing in mail from everybody to analyzing postage through the data every time we bring in a job to make sure that the customer's getting the best possible postage rate, not just assuming that it's going to
Right.
sort at this rate and this is what they're going to pay. So that's really how I started into this business. I really kind of fell backwards into data. And it's been a very lucrative part of my business. And since then, I've been able just to work with people that I worked with in my old company that were they were just good, ethical, honest people.
Hmm.
And next year on January 1st will actually be 10 years.
Yeah. So,
So
are you still employing? You have about 4 employees still,
I don't actually have employees
but
because in the
contractors.
state of, yeah, they're
Yeah.
contractors. They're all independent contractors. So I have five now. Um, and we're going to be adding a new element with a gentleman that I worked with years ago. He owns a company where he helps people internally to get their company set up for either sale or moving on to family, to set things up in a progression plan. And so he works with
Hmm.
a lot of companies. And I approached him. I said, "Well, you've got a lot of companies in your list that could use mail services. And I certainly deal with companies, whether prospect or companies that could use your services." So we're going to be doing some networking there, and I'm very, very excited about that.
Fantastic. And you are still in the 7 figures? You don't have to say the
Yes.
actual revenue. Yeah. So I want
Yeah.
to just point out, in case people missed it, that God actually gave you a business at the age of 68. This is probably surprising to a lot of people that, scripture says that we are to run the race. There is no retirement in the Bible. It's not you're useless once you hit 60 or 65. And so I think it's very inspiring, frankly, that you have been so successful so quickly at a seasoned age and stage in your life. And I just wanted to point that out to people because God is never done with us but, society kind of casts those of us who are over the age of 60 or a certain age, we kind of become irrelevant. Um, and I find that
That's very, very
surprising.
true.
Yeah, I find it
I
surprising.
do too. I do too. Well, there were two things that really made a difference for me in this process. Is I have two granddaughters. And as I was getting ready to start this business, I wasn't financially, unless we started selling things and redoing things in our life, we financially really wasn't in a position that I could retire. I didn't need to make a lot of money, but I did to make some. And I can remember telling my husband, "Gosh, if this takes off and I can work a couple $1,000s a month, I'm happy."
Right.
And I also wanted my granddaughters to know that, you know what, you don't give up when things get bad. You can
Mhm.
do whatever you put your mind to with the help of Jesus.
Yeah.
And when I started this business, I sat right here in this, well, it was a different chair at the time, but I sat right here at this desk and I bowed my head and I basically said, "Lord, this is your business. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. I will honor it in everything I do,
Mm.
from the way that I treat people to tithes to whatever direction you point me in." And I have been able, Carolyn, as you know, to be able to help other women in situations where I would have never been able to do that before. And it gives me goosies just to think about it, as J Lo says. But, um, you know, I never realized, um, Pastor Rick used to say to us all the time, "You can never outgive God. You cannot."
You can
And
outspend
that is
them
one. Yeah,
because
and
I've done it. But yes, you can't
yeah.
outgive him.
Well, and I don't always mean just in money, I think people
Right.
look at that the wrong way. It's like, "Well, I'm doing this and then I'm gonna get it back." Well,
Right.
there are ways that you get things back that don't have anything to do with monetary or money.
That's right.
My oldest granddaughter is graduating, from Pratt University, and she always tells me, "Grandma, I'm so proud of you." I tell all my friends, "My
Oh,
grandma runs a successful business. I'm so proud of you." And that means more to me than anything, uh,
sure.
that I could do outside of that. It's just that pride in your business and pride of knowing what God can do in your life if you just let him have it.
Yes. And if you let him lead, which is
Mhm.
hard for some of us. Well, we're going to jump
Well, yeah.
into, yep, we're going to jump into leadership and all of your
Okay.
wisdom and experience there. Tell us, what is your leadership style or philosophy?
I love collaborative leadership whenever possible. I mean, there are sometimes that you as an owner of company need to be collaborative or you can be a bit participative, but I love collaboration. I think that it makes for everybody involved to put their 2 cents in. In our company, I can honestly tell you between the people that I work with and the things that we talk about on postage and customers, if we have a 5-minute meeting, we're lucky because it just doesn't run that long. It's like we'll get on, we're
Mm-hmm.
efficient, we talk through things. We've had a few meetings that maybe run beyond that where we've got to do some strategies, but I just love the collaboration part because everybody has an ability to um, speak and make a difference in the
Yeah.
decision that we're making.
And scripture says we all have the gifts and talents in the body. And so
Mhm.
collectively, that's how God designed us to work together, right? To leverage each other's gifts and personalities and skills. Who influenced your leadership most along the way?
I would say that was Gary Myers, who I went to work for after I left working, at TRW and some of the other companies in the credit union business. Um, I, through a series of events, ended up working at United Presort Service, and Gary was the owner, Gary and Bruce, and they just were remarkable people. There were 700 employees working at that company. He knew all of their names. He knew their children. Those
Wow.
people had so much respect for him, Carolyn, they would have jumped in front of a running train for him. And he did one thing that just touched me because everybody would say when you went to work there, did you take the Gary walk yet? And I really didn't understand what they meant, but one day he said, "We are gonna go for a walk." And he took me back into operations where the 700 people were, and I was back there all the time, but never to this. And he would say to me, "In Mexico, that gentleman over there is a doctor. That gentleman's a lawyer. His wife works second shift." Um, and he would go through and he would personalize those individuals, make you realize that they were people that had dreams just like you did. And they were working in a strange country. They didn't speak the language, but yet they were still people. And we went through the whole entire plant, and then we went back in his office, and he sat across the table from me, and he said, Janie, you are going to get dressed up every day in a suit. You're going to have an expense account where you're going to take people out to lunch. You are going to enjoy what you do if you're good at it, and you are good at it, so you're going to be fine. He said, but I'll tell you what, you ever disrespect anyone in operations or speak rude to them, I will fire you immediately.
Mm,
Do you understand that? And I had so much respect for him for that
mm,
because, people tend to forget that just because somebody works at a position that may not be or as glamorous or as valuable in your mind as what you're doing, that's not the case. And he really brought that to life and he
yeah.
meant it. They ended up we got all the equipment in. Years later, selling the company, they had said,
Mhm.
"It's time to send this thing off to college."
Yeah.
And I will never forget their last day. All 700 people lined up down the center of the operations, and
Mhm.
as they left, they clapped and, you know, gave them their,
Oh,
just
wow.
it was amazing. They were so good to those people. And, they worked hard. That was a hard
Yeah.
hard job,
Yeah. So
it's not an easy thing.
you learned leadership through modeling, what the
Absolutely,
leaders modeled through you. Any other ways that you learn
absolutely.
leadership?
You know, I throughout my entire career would seek out mentors. Um, when I very first started in sales, when Gary was working with me, he always would tell me, well, first I had to go see all 100 of my customers 3 times, and then he let me go into sales.
Wow.
And I am telling you, I went out with him, and that man could sell, seriously, sell ice to Eskimos, and they would wonder why they bought it when he left. He was just an amazing individual, and he was so good in sales. So when I started in sales, I had those 100 counts were all the little tiny ones that none of the other
Right.
sales reps wanted to take. So he gave them to me. And I wanted to learn. I couldn't get enough of this business. I loved it. And so I would go to the Postal Customer Council meetings. I would go to the trade shows. I
Mm,
couldn't get enough of it. And so
interesting.
there was an account that we had that was a big account. And I went to the manager that managed that account, the sales manager, and I said, "Look, Gene, I would really like to manage this account for you, and I want to learn from this. And I'll do a good job. You can come with me or whatever, but I
Right.
think I'm ready to handle this." And so he said, fine. He took me out and we met with John, large company that handles retirement portfolios for retired individuals. And I met John, and then I went back and met with him and took him out to lunch a week later, and I said, "I asked specifically for your account because I have a lot of respect for you. I see you at the meetings. You really know what you're doing. And if you'll just let me learn from you, I promise I will never let you down. Never let you down."
Wow.
And so I got to manage that account and I learned a lot from it. And I also learned a lot from that experience that I actually was able to really help him in his postage process and how to save money down the line. But after that, I learned that seeking out mentorship was a good thing. I like to watch people and really get a grip on what they were doing
Mhm.
and have respect for individuals. And I never had a problem in going to somebody and saying, "Could you kind of coach me through this? Could you, let me spend some time with you so that I'm understanding how you're managing this process?" And that worked for me. A lot
Yes.
of people are afraid to do that because they're afraid that it shows a weakness. In
Yes.
my particular situation, I don't think it did. I think it showed strength. In with the
Great.
and I have
Yeah.
customers that would come back years later. I still stay in touch with some of these people. They're retired and out on their own, but
Yeah.
we stay in touch.
There are a couple of things I heard in that. One is that ask for what you want and have the humbleness to learn and be mentored and coached by others. And I would agree. I think society in general says, you know what, don't show any weakness at all or what is perceived as weakness. Yet, in all of the women I've ever interviewed, including you and the women in the Trailblazers and Threads of Wisdom book, each one of you were teachable. They have a teachable spirit. And I see that so much in you. And I think it's one of your strengths. And you model it so well. And I think it's something that uh, I don't see it a lot, quite frankly, in a lot of Christian women that I interact with because they're still doing their thing. And I I observe that they haven't hit the wall yet. Some of us hit several walls throughout our careers where we said, the way I'm working is not working. So I need to do
Uh-huh.
something else, right? And turn to the Lord and say, what is going on with me? What am I doing wrong? And a lot of times it's
Uh-huh.
pride. Pride
Uh-huh.
of, right? So,
Mhm.
so thank you for that. Thank you for that. Tell us about your faith at work, your integration of the Lord and your philosophy and practices of what is that? What does that look like?
Well, I never forget who runs this business. And it's really interesting because it's not always all about just tithes and money, but from the day that I started this business, from the time I got my first check in till today, I um I always tithe, always. And help beyond that where I can, to help other women in sometimes tough situations or to grow their businesses, whether it be advice. And I will tell you that there's been very few times where my husband has spoke up and kind of given me advice on something. But I think maybe 2 years into the business, he was looking at our income tax, and he
Mhm.
says, "Goodness, Janie, you don't need to be giving that much money to, Saddleback. What are you doing?" And I remember turning to him, and I didn't, I know I wasn't rude, but I just said to him, "You know what? That's non-negotiable. It's not open for discussion.
Mm.
You know, it's just not."
Yeah.
And um, I haven't. And the other thing is I was reading this question when you and I talked about it about, how do you integrate your faith? And I just think for me, it is integrated to a point where I can't separate it. I couldn't say to you, well, this is my faith part of the business and
Right.
this is Janie part of the business. They're very intertwined.
Yeah.
And that's, how I look at every day that I do things. And there are times where I make mistakes or I get frustrated or I get angry. And I will pull myself back and say, Lord, I need your help with this. I really need your help. And most of the time it's been with interactions with customers or situations where I want help in how do I go about this and
Mhm.
still be strong
Mhm.
and at the same point in time make my point.
Yeah.
So those are really the areas where I have a great deal of um, faith in God and in the business and where I'm placed. Well, I think young, when you first come into the business, whether you're young of age or new to business, it'd be like the same conversation I had with my granddaughter. She went to work for Love Shack Fancy and she's absolutely loving it. But she was telling me in some of her trials in another company where she was working at that there were people that were just mean to her.
Mm.
And I said to her, one thing in that I wish I had known earlier is that you know who you are. And when some people want to challenge that or whatever, you look at it and say, is that advice? Or am I going to let mean spirited people define who I am?
Mm.
Because there will be people that will try to tell you who you are or who you should be, and you need to know yourself well enough to know that no, that's just mean-spirited. And unfortunately, there are mean-spirited people in business, and you need to have faith and to understand how to listen to God's voice to know whether that's true and discern what they're saying. Because I think there's a fine line between somebody giving you advice and especially in today's business world, it's so competitive that there are just people that they don't want to give you advice. They just want to knock you down. And you have to have enough belief in yourself to know you're on the right track. And I think that with young leaders today, I think it goes back to what you were saying is that pride and that desire to want to prove yourself and not show any weaknesses. And that
Mhm.
to me is what I would tell any young person coming into business. It's okay to fail. It's okay to
Amen.
fail because that means that you've tried. If you're failing because you're doing something stupid, that's one thing. But
Yeah.
if you're failing because you put yourself out there and you've tried, then there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
You're going
What
to
do you see
grow and you will
the
continue to grow.
What's the biggest mistake you see other people making, leaders, Christian women leaders in business or leadership?
Leaving God at the door. That was a mistake that I made for years when I was working, when I very first started working, um, is not consulting him through prayer, not taking sitting back and taking a deep breath and realizing that he needed to be part of the decision.
Mm,
Um, and it's hard in society today. It's really hard with the news. You've got everything coming at you, and people are so afraid to speak up for what they believe in. And in some companies, they're not even allowed to speak up for what they believe in. So you have to continue to believe it, not let it go, and be able to show your faith in other ways. But again, I think it's leaving God at the door.
hmm What do you wish that you had known early on in the beginning of your career?
There would be a lot of things that I would not have taken so seriously. I think it's easy, as I don't know, like men do the same thing, to get caught up in the gossip, get caught up in the complaining about the company, get caught up in thinking that you can make changes in areas where you can't really make changes. So I, um, if I had to do it over again, I would not have engaged in that. I would have
Mm,
recognized the areas where I could have made a difference, um, and I would have worked hard on those and stayed away from those things that you can't change. And the reason that I feel so strongly about that is the industry that I worked in the pre-sort or commingling. I went through so many mergers and acquisitions. And every single one of them, the same thing would happen. The management would come in and we bought this company because you're all so wonderful and we're not going to change a thing. Everything's going to stay the same. And then within a month, everything starts changing.
hmm
And they say they want your opinion. And then people start to, get engaged in that. And I learned through the second acquisition that by time they come in and buy the company, or even in a management of a company that's already existing, they've already got their
Right.
course charted. They know where they're going, and it's in their 5-year plan. It's done. And in some cases, they'll take opinions of others, but in many cases, they're not going to do it. So it's just wasted energy to try to change things that you can't. And
Mm.
um, kind of goes back to the old serenity prayer, right? Change what you can, or grant me the ability
Grant
to
me the
know the difference.
serenity
But
yet to know the difference.
yeah, I think you need to do that. You just need to know when you can make a difference and when you can't, and
Mm.
when you can't, leave it alone. It's
Mm.
it's just going to make you a nervous wreck trying to change something you can't change.
In closing, is there any other advice that you'd like to give to the next generations of Christian women in leadership?
Yes, you matter and you can make a difference. Don't ever
Mm.
let anybody tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone hold you back because you're the only one that can hold yourself back. And don't believe what other people tell you. Believe in God and the gifts He gave you and what you can do with them.
And what he says about us.
Exactly. He defines our
Fantastic.
identity. We don't.
That's exactly right. Janey, thank you so much for there are some juicy tidbits in here. So listeners, it's time for you to take one thing or two that you learned from Janey during this interview, and we ask you to apply it this week in your business leadership and management, and then post and let us know what happened and what you did. If you want to hear all of Janey's story and all the wisdom that she has to share, you're going to want to go to Amazon or threadwisdom.com, and you're going to pick up a copy of the Trailblazers book, and you'll read the stories of 15 women, Christian women CEOs, and their wisdom, knowledge, and experience. Until then, help us pass the torch of knowledge to the next generations. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you, Carolyn.